This is Daniel 7, 1 to the end of the chapter. Daniel's dream of 4 beasts in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Daniel had a dream and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. 4 beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and have a fill of the flesh.' After that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all of the 4 beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there was before me another horn, a little one, which came up from among them. And the 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. The horn had eyes like eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair on his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. The interpretation of the dream, I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth. But the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying with its iron teeth and bronze claws, the beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the horn that came up before the 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others, that had eyes and a mouth and spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones, and he will subdue the 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, the power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept this matter to myself.
So after a break over the school holidays and looking at was our short series showing the need to have what is a balanced view of God's word and to therefore not to be too loose in our doctrines to a point that we water down the true gospel, nor to be the other way too tight that we see everyone else as being heretics for what are just minor secondary disagreements, which can then lead to shutting genuine believers out of the church family despite holding to what is really the same core beliefs. Well, after that series, we now today get back to looking at the book of Daniel. Because for most of term 3, we were going through Old Testament passages from the book of 2 Kings in our Connect groups, as well as our 2 series in church from both Habakkuk and Daniel, what was part 1. And we saw in these the fall of the nation of Israel and particularly Judah, and how they had continued to just keep going against all that God told them to do, and how God both warned and then sent the Babylonians to take Judah into exile so they could basically be pruned to then one day be able to return to the promised land sometime in the future, where they would rebuild their community and rebuild the temple and then faithfully worship God once more. And what we saw as we went through the book of Daniel was that it focused on this time that they were in this exile in Babylon and how they had to live with their captors, yet through faith they continued to serve God and not the gods of this foreign and anti-God land. And as we started Daniel part 1, I said that the first 6 chapters are just a series of short stories, each chapter telling us a short little story, recording different situations that Daniel and his friends had to face in this foreign land. That these are some of the most well-known stories in the entire Bible, as there was the story about the writing on the wall and the lion's den, and also things like that fiery furnace that Daniel's 3 friends were thrown into for not bowing before the king's giant statue. And all these showed both the faith these people of God and also God at work in protecting these people and steering things towards what was his big plan of returning them home, of finishing this exile that they were in and to bring Babylon down for its sins and redeeming his people just as he promised would happen. Which is why we finished chapter 6, seeing that Babylon had already been invaded and had now been conquered and was now under the rule of the Persians. And a new king had taken over, and this king would one day send God's people home. But before that return, we now come to what is the second half of the book of Daniel, which is really a bit of a jump back in time to events that happened before this invasion and this fall of Babylon happened. Back to the time when Daniel was still in the midst of this difficult time in exile. Because we see in verse 1 that everything that is happening in this chapter happened in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. And it was Belshazzar who was the final king of Babylon, who died in the invasion that we saw back in chapter 5. So what happens to Daniel here is happening between chapters 4 and 5, probably a good 12 or so years before chapter 5. And it's a vision being given to him during this time about what will happen. And therefore, it's a reminder to him that even though he's stuck in the midst of this, don't lose faith and never give up. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Don't give up. Because as we saw in chapter 5, Belshazzar, the one being spoken of here, the king during the time of this vision, he was not a good king. And we see that he mocked God. And he actually intentionally provoked God's people by using what had been stolen from their homeland when they were conquered years earlier and using it for fun in one of his lavish parties. And whilst Daniel had essentially become the right-hand man of King Nebuchadnezzar, the previous king, by being the one to advise him and to interpret the dreams that God was giving him. Well, when we got to this King Belshazzar, we saw that he had forgotten that Daniel even existed. He didn't even know about him. And eventually, when he heard about him, he only called on him once the hand wrote on the wall and he realized how much trouble he was in. When he needed Daniel's help, then he was like, Daniel, come tell me what this all means. So today and over the coming weeks, we'll now be looking at not the dreams and messages given to the kings of Babylon that Daniel had to interpret, as we saw in the first half of the book, but instead the dreams and messages that were given to Daniel himself during that time period, when all that was going on, whilst Daniel was helping with the visions and the messages that were being given to the kings of Babylon. And as said at the start of part 1 of Daniel, the book is in these two clear halves, and where 1 to 6 looked at what was historical events and how God's people remained faithful in exile and how God protected them and he opened up opportunities for them to serve him. Now we move into what is the part of visions given to Daniel, and therefore move into what is a very different style of writing. Because we now move from history to something the same as what is seen in the book of Revelation. And one that many people, especially just in the last couple of weeks with all that's been going on in Gaza, are now reading, and they're now trying to work out, well, what happens next? What does it all mean? What can this tell me about the future and what's going on in the world? Are the events in the world today, these prophecies that were spoken of back then, are they now come to fulfillment? Can we now connect world events to what was written all the way back here? So even now, this is an important book, particularly as I said in the last couple of weeks, people are opening it back up and going, what can this tell me? Just as they're opening up Revelation. They're looking at this, and it is an important part of the Bible. Even if, like Revelation, it can get a bit hard at times to get our head around. But that is why we're going to be looking at it now, because it is important. But before we get started, how about I pray for us as we work our way through chapter 7 this morning? As I said, it's difficult to understand, and a lot of people try to use it as like a detailed plan of the future and try to interpret it with modern day events. So we want to read it in a way that actually gives the message God wants to give us, not what we're trying to find in it. So as we now approach it, how about I pray that we'll be given the wisdom to do that, to make sure that we're reading it as a message from God that we need to understand in a bigger picture sense, and making sure that we're not getting confused by all these little weird prophecies and visions and details in it. So how about I pray for us? Father, we pray now as we return to the book of Daniel. We ask that you'll help us as we work our way through this difficult section, and that you'll give us the faith to see this as a true revelation about your plans for the world, but at the same time, also the wisdom to not be over-analyzing things and seeing connections in every event happening in our world today. Amen. So looking at the passage now, unlike what we normally do as we did as we went through chapters 1 to 6, we're not going to go through this second half of the book verse by verse, looking at every part of it in detail. as there is a lot here. The chapters are very big, and it's not the kind of writing in which you can really do that. We're not going to skip any of it. We will reference each verse in some way, but we'll be looking at paragraphs and whole sections as sort of blocks. So I'm not going to read out each verse and then speak in detail as to what it's all about, as we did when we were going through chapters 1 to 6. Because this type of apocalyptic writing, as it's known, it uses a lot of imagery, and it speaks of things using visions and clues as to what the future might hold, which means that it's not instructive like, say, a letter from Paul, a New Testament letter telling you what you should and shouldn't do, nor is it historical narrative like something, say, the book of Acts, that simply says that this happened, and then this person said this, and then they went there, much like what we saw in the first half of this book in chapters 1 to 6. Instead, this kind of writing, it's trying to convey a larger point, and it's focusing on a sort of a big picture image. And it's not to have every part of it interpreted literally, looking for connections with the world around us. Because, as mentioned just at the start, many people do read passages like this and passages from a book like Revelation. And they're always saying that this event is happening in our world today, so this is now chapter 7 of Daniel being fulfilled. And this is happening now, so that must mean that the next thing that we read in chapter 8 or 9, well, that's got to happen soon. That's going to happen in a week or 6 months or in 2 years or whatever. They're trying to figure it all out. And after making these connections, what we often see is that many years pass by and nothing happens, meaning that these predictions were clearly not right. But then decades, maybe even centuries later, another bigger world event happens, and a new generation go looking for those connections again. The cycle repeats itself, which is what happens when you go reading this verse by verse, trying to figure out every little detail, because when you do that, you end up missing that bigger message. When you read it like that, what often happens is, as they say, you can't see the forest for the trees. So we just want to look at that bigger picture today. And just by briefly looking at this passage, we can see that this is clearly in two parts. There's two sections in this chapter. There is the first half, which is the vision. It's given an idea of what's to come. And Daniel was then given, in the second half, an explanation for what this vision is. And we're also seeing in this part Daniel's response. How does he respond to having this vision in a big picture sense revealed to him? So it has this obvious divide in the chapter. And because of that, that's how we're going to look at it. We're going to quickly look at the vision and what it means, and then we'll try and see what the interpretation of it was so we can better understand it. So looking at the vision, verses 1 to 14, we see this vision. It comes to Daniel in a dream. And we see in this vision, in this dream, two main things. We see firstly the vision of 4 beasts. As it says in verses 2 and 3, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of that sea. And he then goes on to describe these 4 beasts, and we see that they're a mixture of animals that we could recognize, but in a combination with other animals that makes them almost freakish, sort of monster-like. So, for example, he says in verse 4, the first was like a lion. There's an animal, right? We can picture that. But then it says it had wings of an eagle. And then he says, I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being. And the mind of a human was given to it. So as said before, we are getting some really unusual imagery being given here. But what is meant by it, what we get from it is, even if we can't understand the image, we can clearly see that it's meant to be a terrifying image. And it's going to represent something. The terrifying image of what it is, that represents something. And this will be part of a bigger message and revelation of what is to come from Daniel's point of time. from where he is in history, him looking forward. That from this chapter through to the end, he's getting the glimpse of what is his future and the road going forward. Bits of it could be our future, bits of it could also be our past. And as we read on, we see similar bizarre descriptions of what these other beasts are like. So verse 5 speaks of something like a bear that is told to devour, to go and get full. Then verse 6 describes a leopard-like creature with a man's head and wings, and is given authority to rule. And then a final one in verse 7 that Daniel says was terrifying and frightening and very powerful. Because he then says it had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from the former beast, and it had 10 horns. And as we read on in verse 8, it speaks of these horns replacing each other, especially a little one that had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. So if the first three beasts of verses 4 to 7, if they're supposed to be scary, terrifying in the way that they're presented, well, the one that's being portrayed last, the fourth one, is supposed to be far worse again. That this one is essentially going to be the king of the monsters and the one that comes and destroys even those that came before it. So the whole imagery so far is conveying something that is supposed to be frightening and something that will one day actually impact the world. That the message is that real people will be attacked and civilizations will be destroyed, and these beasts, whatever they are, these strange beasts, whatever they're meant to be, they're going to be the ones bringing this all about. Which is why I said before, the details of them are not really the focus. We're not supposed to picture a literal lion with wings here. But what they look like, what animal is used, it's to represent something. So the main point of it is we're supposed to see that these things are scary and they're going to have an impact on the world. They're going to exist in the world. And we're going to see the reaction to them. And we're supposed to learn from the reaction to them, that they're going to be controlling the world. They're going to be bringing fear and bringing people under almost a form of slavery under their rule, however that's going to actually appear in practice. Because what we see here is that they're portrayed as some kind of unstoppable monster that comes up seemingly out of nowhere. It says they rise out of the sea. And of course, the sea, that is where all the chaos and the danger comes from. The sea itself is a scary place. And they leave destruction and fear wherever they are. That they're essentially the manifestation of evil. And if you've read the book of Revelation, you're probably thinking that a lot of this, what we're seeing here, is very familiar. It is so far using very similar imagery, as it's using animal features to describe what are characteristics of whatever these things are going to be, which is why we need to be approaching this the same way that we would approach the book of Revelation, trying to understand the message of it through the imagery that is given. Because then as we read on, even though we now get a change in what the vision focuses on, we see that it uses even more very Revelation-like language. We get even more parallels between the messages of these two books. In fact, it's incredible how close these two books are now aligned, despite being written centuries apart. Because it now says in verses 9 and 10, as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all blaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. And this here now is so much like the descriptions given in Revelation for the return of Jesus and the court of God in which he judges the world. Because we read in Revelation chapter 1, in verses 14 and 15, that when Jesus returns, his appearance will be like this. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace. We see here, it's almost word for word as how the Ancient of Days is described in Daniel. It's so similar in the wording and the language that it's using to tell us something about the character of God. Likewise, we then read in Revelation chapter 5, in verse 11, how everyone surrounds him as he is the center of creation. Because it says there, then I looked and heard the voice of many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands and 10,000 times 10,000. They encircled the throne and the living creature and the elders. And it makes this point even more obvious when we turn a couple of chapters later in Revelation chapter 7 and verse 9, because it then says, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. So we're actually already here, centuries before Jesus even came, seeing the same imagery that will be used in Revelation, this court of God that will have him right in the center, in the middle of all things. And there'll be so many angels and so many of God's people all around him that the number will be uncountable. That's what 10,000 by 10,000 is about. It's saying, as this was written, what's the biggest number we can express? How do we express a very big number? For them, 10,000. That's about as big as they could get. So it then says, let's get 10,000 and times that by 10,000. Not to give a literal number of 100 million, but the idea of an unfathomable number, an uncountable number. Billions and billions of angels and people all around the throne of God. And beyond just this imagery of God being pure, as the white represents, and refining all that is not pure, as the fire represents, there is also this idea in Revelation of the books being opened at the time of judgment. And these books showing all that everyone has done and whose book is going to be recorded for basically the invitation list into heaven. And we see the same idea of the books here in Daniel in verse 10. So both Daniel and Revelation, they're using very similar imagery because they are clearly speaking of the same thing. They both speak of the evil that will consume the world. They'll both speak of this evil being represented by these freakish, beast-like characters. And they'll also speak of what is the response of God that comes to these beasts and this evil and what happens after the judgment. The judgment that's going to be made by the Lord over all creation, and who these beasts, no matter how powerful they may be on earth, will eventually be held accountable to, will have to answer before and be judged by. Which is why as this vision finishes, we see in verses 11 and 12, but it now speaks of the fate of these beasts. It says that they're going to be destroyed as they're thrown into the fire. And then it says in verses 13 and 14, it now makes the main point that when their limited rule comes to an end, it's to be replaced by another authority and whose rule will last forever. That everlasting power and authority over all creation, over all those angels and all those people that you can't count before the throne, they're going to be given. That authority is going to be given to a chosen one. That he will be given authority and glory and sovereign power. And he's going to be given this over all things, bringing an end to the reign of these terrifying beasts. So there's the vision that Daniel was given. It's cryptic, it's hard to understand, but the big point of it, the message of it, I think is very clear. That there are some things that ruin this world, and those things are evil, they're terrifying, and they destroy all that is good. But there is assurance being given that there is one greater than them, again, and he will destroy their rule, and he will then rule after them, and he will rule forever. That this is actually an encouragement to not lose hope in the world as it is now, but to know that the future is written and that future is good. That for Daniel here, in his moment of his life at this point of time, in this land of exile under a Babylonian king that mocks God and thinks that he rules the world, that this is being said to Daniel to give him hope and to hold the faith and to know that one day justice will come and all things will be made right. So for now, at this moment, just hold on. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Now, having looked at what the vision is, this now leads to what is the interpretation that is given in this passage, what this strange imagery is all about. Because this all has, as I said, a meaning behind it. Even if Daniel or ourselves can't fully understand all the imagery, if we can get a bit lost at times looking at all those trees. Because we do see in verses 15, 16 that Daniel is troubled by what he has seen. But lucky for him, we also see that he's not alone at this moment, that there is someone there giving him this vision who can now walk him through it so that he can have, if not a perfect understanding, at least get the message of it, at least come to understand that bigger picture. And we see that this person, whoever this person is, we see that what he says to Daniel about this vision starts in verse 17. And we quickly see that the four beasts that were presented as this weird hybrid animal-like monsters in the dream, they're actually kings. That they are rulers who have their time on earth, or at the very least, based on what we see further down in verse 23, are kingdoms or empires that will rule for a set time. And then straight away after telling Daniel this, explaining this part of the imagery, we then see in verse 18 what the other part of this vision is all about, the other person in it. Because it says here, but the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever, yes, forever and ever. So again, the whole complete picture is being given just in these couple of verses, that the kings, the bad kings, the evil kings, will rule and their kingdoms are going to cause havoc. But the people of God, they've got nothing to fear, as the kingdom that they're a part of will outlive these kings, and that kingdom will be the only one that's going to last forever. So almost straight away, in just a couple of verses, Daniel's had his vision explained. He's been given the reassurance and the encouragement to know that whatever dangers and trials God's people face on earth, this will end because the future is written, and those kings who persecute him and God's people, they're going to be destroyed. God's people will win out as God has a plan for them, so don't fear the rulers of this world, as their rule will come to an end. But we see that whilst the main point of it has already been summed up in just a couple of verses, Daniel still wants more information. And the information that he wants is particularly about the fourth beast. What is that one all about? Because it already said in the vision back in verse 7 that it was different from all the former beasts and it had 10 horns. And Daniel wants to understand that part of it, which is what most of this explanation will now go on to do. So we see in verses 19 through 22 that we get more details about this, more about the horns and the horns seemingly coming and going, replacing each other, at least until God pronounces judgment and brings us all to an end. And the answer is then given in verse 23, where it says, the fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms, and it will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. So we get the idea that this is different because it probably is the last one, that it will rule over everything and is not just limited to one specific area. It's going to be something far bigger than that, world-changing. And this is something that's going to last, therefore, a long time. This one cannot come within the lifespan of just one human king, but it will spread and it will multiply, probably over centuries or maybe even longer. Because he then says in verse 24, the 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue the 3 kings. He'll speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. So we're seeing that this last one is something more insidious than the others and more directed in its attack against God's people. That this one rules with an agenda and it will last over many generations, and that its agenda is to destroy God's people and to undermine his ways. And that this agenda may be implemented in different parts of the world, even at the same time, and be brought about under different kings, even at the same time. But it is all part of the same purpose. It's all coming from this 4th beast. It's a worldwide movement in opposition to God, and it will specifically attack his people. And that it's going to pervert morality. It's going to try and turn the world upside down, turn good into bad and bad into good, to bring people under its own rule and to have people following its ways and not God's. But as destructive as this beast will be, with its agenda, the big point is that its rule will last only for a set time. Because that's what it means by the holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. And whilst those times might be for a very long period, at least by our standards, because they may span over centuries, and for all we know, even millennia, the good news is it will not last forever. That it is a time that has been set by God himself, and whilst it may last for many generations, it does have an end point. It can't go on forever. So what this vision is basically saying to Daniel is a final evil is coming that will be worse than anything before, and it will attack God's people, but it will not last forever. That its time of rule has a set end, which is what we clearly see as we now end this passage and look at what comes next after it. What is it that comes after this final kingdom that splits and spreads and devours the entire world? Because Daniel now gets reassurance given to him that good will eventually come, where he is told, but the court will sit and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. So this is what we looked at before. When the Son of God returns and brings judgment on the world, then he will replace the world's kingdoms with his own. And this evil that we see represented by these beasts and these kingdoms of the world, they're going to be destroyed once and for all, and then his kingdom is the one that lasts forever. It's the one that never comes to an end. That his kingdom, it is not for a set time, but is in fact the opposite. It's everlasting. So Daniel need not fear, because behind the scenes there is a war, and God will not lose this war. That there will be a final confrontation between the beast seen here and the Son of Man, the Holy One of God. The one, as we know, is Jesus Christ. And when this battle happens, only one is going to be left standing. That this is not going to be an eternal stalemate, like 2 superpower nations, where neither are able to guarantee victory over the other in a battle. But instead, in this case, there will be a clear victor. And that winner has already been decided. As I said back in verse 14, he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshipped him. And then said, his dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And this shows us Jesus' victory is going to be comprehensive. Because the time for his kingdom to start it is synchronized with the set time in which the beast rule comes to a final end. So this is all being revealed to Daniel to be that encouragement and comfort, not to lose hope, to know that the future is in fact bright, to know that even if he isn't near the end, at his moment of time, near the end of this spiritual war that has lasted since the Garden of Eden and is going to continue on and only intensify in the centuries to come, that as grim as that might sound and as discouraging as those facts might be, he's being told it's not something that he needs to fear. He doesn't need to worry about the current situation he and his people are in, as it's just a link in a long chain of events, but God is steering all of those events. So the message of Daniel is just trust in him and have your hope in his promises to bring about his kingdom and defeat this evil once and for all. And as that is the message to Daniel, then that is the same message for us today as well. Because we could likewise get caught up in the bad news of the world around us and lose sight of the light at the end of the tunnel. That it is easy when the world is falling apart around us to think that the current issue is the end of the world. It is the worst thing that could happen. And it's also why we should not look at this part of Daniel and try to connect it with the current issue, whatever that issue might be, because that is what many have done, especially when they lose hope and are in a bad situation. But as Daniel is taught here, the war has been going on for a long time and it still has a long way to go. Because at the time God's people are in Babylon, many of them are probably thinking, how could things get worse? Right? This has got to be rock bottom. And we see, though, throughout history, that many people have thought similar ways. That they could look at their time in history and think that this is the coming of the end of this set time. This is rock bottom. This is where things couldn't get any worse. Because even a century ago, people would have been living during the Second World War. And they surely at times, many of them would have been thinking it's got to be the end of the age. The world surely can't come from this. The beast has taken over. But the point is, we don't know when this world will end. All we have to do is know that it will end. And know that the time is set for it to end. The time when Jesus will return. And the current issue, or maybe the next issue, or the issue 10 from then, that will be the last one and that will be dealt with. It's all going to be fixed in the future. We don't know where we are on that timeline. We just have to know that it is coming to an end at some point. And because we know that it will be good when we get there, to not lose hope in the meantime, to not be discouraged, but just keep remembering that God has this under control. Now, of course, that's a message we see in other parts of the Bible. It's a message you'll hear in lots of other sermons. And it's often easier said than done to keep saying, look towards the light at the end of the tunnel. Look towards the good. It's easy to say that, but it's often hard to actually believe it, especially when you are in those hard times, especially when you are in the middle of the crisis. And we even see that for Daniel here. We see as Daniel, who is the one receiving this message and receiving it firsthand, that it then says right at the end in verse 28, this is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts and my face turned purple. Meaning that whilst this is meant to be reassuring and giving hope in the future, the path to that day where all things are made right, well, it can still be very troubling living in that moment of crisis. Still be troubling thinking about all the things that's got to happen between now and then. Which is why we shouldn't pretend that nothing matters. Or even worse, starting to actually think that nothing matters. That if millions die in a war at the hand of the beast that rules the world today, that we simply say, well, so what? Plenty have died before then, plenty more will die before the set time is up. It doesn't really matter, does it? today doesn't matter. Keep your eyes on the future. Well, of course, it does matter. And we see that even those in exile, they grieved the situation they were in. Even Daniel, being given all this information and all this hope and encouragement, he's still grieved, he's still worried, he's still disturbed by it all. So you don't have to be indifferent or callous to that which is happening, the current issue, or that which is happening around us. But the main point is, in all that calamity, don't lose hope. Don't lose hope. Know that whatever's happening, it is for a set time, maybe generations after ourselves, maybe tomorrow. But God is in control. And that's the big point to always remember. The promises of God, know that he has all things set. And to know that evil, it cannot win out. That's the point of it here. It can't win, as his kingdom will ultimately destroy it. And then when it destroys it, it's going to replace it with the perfect kingdom and the one that lasts forever.